And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. With me again is my great friend William Bell over here in that black shirt, whatever that.
You have had recent eye surgery, haven't
Yeah, I
you?
had eye surgery, William. Oh,
I
that's a
think it's
beautiful color.
lavender, some color of
Yeah,
lavender.
it's lilac or lavender or something like that. It's a beautiful color, though.
Thank you.
But I had to rib you just a little bit. So anyway, last week we began a review of William's very recent debate with Scott Clem, who says he was a former dispensationalist and claims now to be an amillennialist. Although William and I are agreed that he was still making a lot of dispensational arguments in his presentation. So he's got some baggage left over, let me say, from his debate or from his premillennial dispensational days. So we covered a lot of territory last week, William, as we examined a lot of the things that Scott had to say. And we closed out the program by examining the fact that Scott ridiculed you and preterists pretty hard during the Q&A. He asked you, when was the atonement completed? And you made the comment that the atonement was a process, that it began with the crucifixion of Christ, carried through until the parousia. And he ridiculed that awfully hard. So I thought we'd take another look at that because, listen, I get condemned for this on Facebook all of the time when I say that the atonement was not consummated at the cross. The atonement was purchased at the cross. It was applied at the parousia, consummated and applied. So why don't you share some thoughts with us on this entire question about, was the atonement consummated at the cross?
Okay, I agree with you that it was, began at the cross through the death of Christ, because Christ, is the Passover, and he also was the high priest who made an offering for sin. Hebrews 1:3, there are a ton of passages that refer to that throughout the book of Hebrews. We have the history of and the type of the high priest in Leviticus chapter 16, going into the tabernacle to do the work of atonement. Leviticus 9 is a good example of that as well, which you could pretty much lay Leviticus 9 down beside Hebrews 9, which is,
Right.
One of the things that I pointed out in the debate. So I would say, first of all, Scott's arguments were based on, he starts his arguments on Romans chapter 3. And I'll read that. And this is where he will argue that the atonement was complete at the cross. That's one of the places. Then the other place, of course, will go to some of the passages that mention the atonement in Romans 5 and in 2 Corinthians 5, which there he makes linguistic arguments. But in Romans 3, the text says, and I'll start at verse 23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus." Now, this text on the surface, if you do just a surface reading of it, it will, some people just think that, all it's talking about is Jesus is dying on the cross. But when you look at the language a bit more carefully, it says that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And the idea of justification or righteousness is also a resurrection concept. It's also a resurrection term that is not completed or consummated, as you were saying before, until the coming of Christ. And when you're paralleling that, as we said, with Leviticus 9, with Hebrews 9, and speaking of the work of the high priest, going in, making the sacrifice, and that's Hebrews 9. He enters into the presence behind the veil, and then he appears, out of the second, in verse 28. That is referring to the time of the second coming, demonstrating that the atonement is completed at that point. And then on his passages in Romans chapter 5 and in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, one of the things that I pointed out in the discussion were, even looking at it from a linguistic point of view, you're all right. You're looking at, yeah, hopefully Ori gets that phone. I just, when that came, no, she didn't get it. I'm not sure if she's looking at it, but I'm sorry about that. I keep forgetting this thing.
Well, I brought up Romans chapter 5 because it was a passage that he brought up, citing Romans 5:11. And not only that, but we rejoice through God, rejoice in God through Jesus Christ, through whom also we have now received. His emphasis was on, we have now received that. And I had to test out my learning how to share a screen here. Can you see that?
I can see it.
Okay, very good. I'm so proud of me.
Okay, so in the text, for if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his son, much more having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And not only that, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have received the reconciliation. And that word reconciliation, of course, is the word for atonement in these passages. And so his use of we have now received, I wondered if you would have brought up the a text that shows the Greek in that. But the point being that I made in the debate was that outside of the present active indicative, which is the mode that has where time is a factor in the aorist. In other words, when you're in the, according to the Greek grammars, when you're in the present active indicative, that's where you can look at the aorist and say, okay, this happened at this time, this happened at that time, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're outside of that mode, then time is not a factor in terms of determining when something occurred. And you may have what's called the constitutive aorist, which means that the action has begun at some point in the past, which is the simple statement of the aorist, but it has no bearing on when that action was actually consummated. So you could be looking at the beginning of that action, you could be looking at a midpoint of that action, or you could be looking at the consummation of that action. But that's what the constitutive aorist is all about. It encompasses the entire period, even though it states it as past. And if I'm not mistaken, because I pulled some of these passages even when I was studying with, when I was preparing for the debate with Sam Frost, because I figured they might come up then. And one of these passages or two has an aorist subjunctive in it.
Oh,
that talks, oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh
It
yeah.
has the aorist subjunctive, which would mean, as you and I know, that the aorist subjunctive means that the action has begun, that the individuals are participating in the process in some way, and that it was an ongoing present situation.
With the future aspect of it.
Yes, with the future aspect to be consummated at some time in the future. That's the same argument that we make from 1 Corinthians 15:49, et cetera. So I will leave it at that, and I'll take a moment while you're doing that to search in the background to see if I can locate the actual text with the aorist subjunctive in it, and then we can put that on the screen as well so people can see what we're talking about.
Okay, well, I would simply like to point out that when people say, well, okay, the atonement was consummated at the cross, then what that means is, what they're saying without undoubtedly without thinking about it, what they're saying is that the atonement was consummated at the time of the Passover. Well, wait a minute.
Yes.
Wait a minute. The Passover was not for the atonement. And I've asked several individuals, okay, if the atonement was consummated at the cross, then why did Israel have both the Passover feast and the Feast of Atonement. It's because they saw those as separate and distinct realities taking place at two different times. Now, Tom Holland, in his book, Contours of Pauline Theology, does point out that in a lot of the ancient rabbis, the rabbis said that there was an element that seems, I think that's the word that Tom Holland brings up, that there was an element or an aspect of atonement associated with Passover, but it absolutely was not the Passover. So, pardon me, again, it brings up the question.
Was not the atonement, you mean?
I'm sorry?
Is that what you meant to say? You said there was an element of atonement associated with the Passover, but are you saying that was not the Passover or was not the atonement?
No. I'm saying that the atonement was not the Passover, although
Right.
although there was some elements of the atonement attached to Passover in rabbinic thought. But again, they were totally separate times. They were two totally separate feasts. And so it's completely inappropriate. Your picture, your video locked up there, William. I don't know what happened. But I think this is a critically important question. There you are. Critically important question to ask when Scott Clem says the atonement was finished at the cross. To reiterate my point, that's saying that the atonement is the Passover. The Passover is the atonement. So it raises the question, once again, I would ask, if the atonement was consummated at the time of the Passover sacrifice, why were there two separate feast days, one for Passover, one for the atonement? And I've asked that question numerous times, William, on Facebook. When people would challenge me and attack me, I would simply ask them, why were there two separate feast days? One was Passover, which is never called the atonement, even though some of the ancient rabbis, once again, would mention atonement aspects of it, but they never called it the atonement. So why is there Passover? Why is there, by the way, 5 months later, 4.5 months later, why is there the Day of Atonement? It's because they're separate.
Yes. And then when you look at the Passover and you talk about the Passover of Christ, it says Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us. But even in viewing that, along with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was an ongoing celebration, in an ongoing feast as far as the new covenant was concerned, they didn't end the in terms of the antitype. The Feast of Unleavened Bread wasn't ended at the cross when Jesus rose from the dead. That was something that was continually going on, because what Paul told them in 1 Corinthians 5:7 and following, he says, let us keep the feast. So they were still involved in that feast that's connected with Passover from that perspective. And so as far as my reading of Tom Holland, as you were saying, he indicates that there is some atonement aspect of Passover involved in that. Also, as you were saying, the Passover, and this is a saying from Hogarth, little short phrase that he uses, Passover was for the hiding of sins, and atonement was for the taking away of sins. But that's an element that, sort of they miss, even in terms of dealing with the coming of Christ, period. And that is the fact that his return had anything to do with the taking away of sins. And to deny that simply denies a lot of scripture as well.
Another question that I would pose to people like Scott Clem, and I've posed it to a number of people on Facebook and YouTube: if the atonement was finished at the cross, did Jesus have to enter into the most holy place there to offer him his life for the atonement? Now, if you're going to say it was over and done with and finished at the cross, then he didn't have to ascend into the heavens there to enter into the most holy place.
Yeah, that would be a great point. Why would he have to go in if the atonement was already completed?
Yeah, it wouldn't have to come back out for salvation, which,
Right.
as you pointed out in Leviticus chapter 9, I think maybe that's worth just another moment or two of development. In Leviticus chapter 9, when the high priest went into the most holy place to make the sacrifices, the blessings on the congregation were not given. The text is very, very clear. The blessings on the congregation were not given until he came back out. So how have we received the atonement, as Clem would argue, if in fact Christ has not come out of the most holy place to bestow those blessings?
Mm-hmm.
Is that not a valid question?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, let me see here. I had some other things, Mark, that I thought we would want to cover. Uh, excuse me. Oh, he went to Hebrews chapter 10, 17 and following. Having therefore great boldness, brethren, to enter into the most holy place, having our conscience cleansed from dead works and our bodies washed with pure water, let us come boldly before the throne of grace, that we might. I'm throwing Hebrews chapter 4 and Hebrews chapter 10 together here. Enter into the most holy place with boldness. That we have access into the most holy place. So once again, Scott was using the present tenses in both Romans chapter 5, we have received the atonement, and entering into the most holy place. Let us enter into that which is within the veil, since we have great boldness. So that goes back, does it not, William, to all of these tenses, and that's over. Even Scott Clem, during this debate, over and over, he said, well, this is part of the already but not yet. Well, okay. Why don't you see the already but not yet in respect of the atonement? Why don't you see the already but not yet? And Paul or Apollos, whoever wrote Hebrews, is referring to, let us enter into that which is within the veil. Does that not apply in that already but not yet? They're stating, we could express it like this. This is proleptic. What is prolepsis? It is bringing what is still in the future into the present verbally, because the future is so sure to happen. Did I make that clear enough?
Yeah, yeah. And you know, the other side of that is he was arguing, as you say, for the already but not yet. The point was he was switching from a spiritual to a physical. And then
Oh,
on the
yeah.
one hand, he argued for the physical because he would, when he would talk about the first resurrection, he would say, well, that's Christ being raised physically. And then we would have another body, you know, that another physical or bodily resurrection at the end. So, but he called it his two stages of resurrection. You got the first resurrection, and that's what he was calling the second resurrection. Well, in between that, you got the fact that he argued also that they had been raised spiritually from the dead. And so what we've got is actually two resurrections in Christ that are supposed to be the eschatological resurrection, and not understanding the interrelatedness of Jesus's physical resurrection in regard to the body that he was establishing for and through which sins were being removed. And that forms the consummated part of the resurrection. And that's the major point that you know, these futurist guys who want to argue that way fail to understand and to grasp.
Okay. And he thought, I sat there kind of stunned, to be honest about it, but he obviously thought that he had a really major point on 1 John chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. And now, little children, we are the sons of God, but it does not yet appear what we shall be like, but we shall be like him when he appears. And I thought his entire emphasis was on the way that we look in his
Yeah.
in his paradigm. So why don't you develop that a little bit more?
Well, as I mentioned in the debate, one of the things, and I left out a major point that I should have stated, but the first thing was with his trying to focus on the physicality of it, or what we would look like, because if you're going to take the resurrection as physical, you got to be focused on that at some point and time. But here's the point: the text says, now are we the sons of God, and it has not yet, or does not yet appear, what we shall be. But when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Now, here are the apostles talking. And the apostles had already, according to 1 John chapter 1, saw Jesus Christ. They looked upon him, which, if that's the looking that I'm thinking, it's a very intent look upon him. In other words, they didn't just take a casual stare at him. They handled him. The narrative in Luke says they ate with him, they touched him, and handled him. So they knew what the physical aspect of Jesus was all about. That's the very thing that these guys are arguing, that he's going to come back in the same body with the same appearance and everything. And yet here is John saying in 1 John 3 that it has not yet appeared what he shall be. So that's a major contradiction to start with from the beginning. Secondly, when we talk about what had not appeared, he's talking about, the word appear there is the word to manifest. Now, in Jesus's first coming, when the question was asked of John, are you the Christ? John chapter 1, for example. He says, no, I'm not. Are you Elijah? No, I'm not. Are you one of the prophets? No, I'm not. He says, but I am the one who comes, to tell you about, one whose shoelaces I'm not worthy to,
I'm the
stoop
voice of
down
one crying in the wilderness.
Yeah, and lace up, etc. He says, but I have come that I might manifest him to Israel. Now, how did John manifest Christ? Of course, through his baptism. He says, the one upon whom you see the spirit of the dove, landing upon and remaining, that's the one who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. That's the one who is basically the Messiah of Israel, etc. Well, they saw that. That was physical. John manifested him in the flesh. But what was the contention with the Jews the whole time that Jesus was in the flesh? They were contesting his claim, which you can see in John 5 and other chapters, that he was the Son of God, that he had this spiritual relationship with God. As a matter of fact, they opposed it so vehemently that they tried to kill him many, many times, not because he raised somebody from the dead, or because particularly that he healed someone on the Sabbath, etc., according to John 5, but it says, because you make yourself equal with God, claiming that you're God's son. So that was a spiritual reality of Christ that they could not detect just by looking at him. And even his disciples asked him on one occasion, show us the Father. And Jesus pointed to his actions that would reveal that. Well, you can't see God because he's invisible, but that's what Christ was revealing at his return, was that spiritual revelation of Christ. That's what was veiled, that had to be unveiled, and that's what was being revealed through the fall of the temple, through the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's what Jesus said to them in Matthew chapter 24:30. Here's another interesting passage I'll throw in with that, which is parallel to 1 John 3. And there are some other points in 1 John 3 that, we could talk about. But in Colossians 3, Paul wrote to the Colossians, saying to them that they were dead and their life was hidden with Christ in God. Now, I don't think Paul wrote to people in the graveyard. I don't think he wrote to disembodied spirits. He wrote to physical beings, corporeal beings who were in the church in Colossae. But he said they were hidden. Now, I understand and believe that that's the same manner in which they were not manifested in 1 John 3. But he says, when Christ, who is our life, appears, then you shall appear with him in glory. So they were not physically hidden, and they were going to be manifested or revealed. But how were they going to be revealed? Or In what way? They were going to be revealed as the true sons of God. Why? Because that was the backdrop of the contention going on in the New Testament. That's the backstory of who's really a child of Abraham, who's really a son of Abraham.
That's right.
Is it the Jews who have physical circumcision, who have the temple and all of its accoutrements, etc.? Are they rather the sons of God? Well, John the Baptist said, don't even think about it. Jesus said, you are of your father, the devil, yet they thought that they were. Well, there was going to come a time when there was going to be a separation of the wheat and tares. So there would be this decisive event that would declare that once and for all. And that was the destruction of the temple, the judgment upon the Jews, where they were killed, went into captivity, lost their temple and all of their covenant relationship with God. And it was the believers who were declared as the true sons of Abraham, who inherited the promises. And that is the meaning of Colossians 3, of 1 John 3, that people just miss because of their focus on the physicality of it all, and has nothing to do with a physical relationship.
Yeah, and directly related to that is 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. Paul said, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation, that if we confess him, we shall live, to paraphrase. If we deny him, he will deny us. But we believe, Paul said, that if we died with him, that's Colossians chapter 3, we shall also live with him. And I think you pointed out last week, and I seem to have lost your video there, William. Yeah, there you come.
Oh, I'm here. I had to take care of some biological issues.
But anyway, here's Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 2 saying we believe that if we died with him, we shall also live with him. Just like Colossians chapter 3, we're both just real sure Paul's not talking about or talking to people that had died biologically. And think about this, folks, the resurrection that was out in front, still in the future, that which Paul says, we believe that if we died with him, we shall live with him, is the direct counterpart to the death. Now, if the death is not biological death, then the resurrection is not biological resurrection. And that gets to Romans chapter 6, does it not, William?
It absolutely does.
Which Scott Clem thought he had a point on it. We shall be like him in the likeness of his resurrection. And so Scott says Jesus was raised physically. Of course, we believe Jesus was raised physically. He just wasn't raised in a transformed, immortal, incorruptible body, like Scott Clem says. So why don't you show us that interconnectedness between what you were trying to express to Scott in Romans 6, Colossians 3, 2 Timothy chapter 2, because they all fit together.
Yeah, all of those passages are related. The text that you just mentioned in 2 Timothy, if we be dead with Christ, we believe that we shall live with him. Well, there's a future in that particular text. And as you say, the life stands over against the death. They had not died physically. And that, by the way, refutes the argument that he was making in 2 Timothy chapter 2, because Paul's argument was not that the dead were raised already in a consummated sense, as Hymenaeus and Philetus was saying. He said in 2 Timothy 4:1 that they were about to raise the dead, that Jesus was about to appear. And so that's the difference between the full preterist view and the assumption and assertion of their faulty argument that they're trying to make against us. But in Romans chapter 6, which argumentation starts, at least in chapter 5, and actually earlier, but let's say in chapter 5, when he talks about the death that's being introduced through Adam, one of the things that he shows when he talks about the one who is coming is that the correlation between Adam, through which sin entered, and the one who was coming, and the word melantos is used there that indicates that imminence, is that it's an eschatological difference between the prototypical Adam and Christ in that text. So it's not a reference to Jesus coming into the world the first time, if you please. That's included because you really can't separate the cross and the parousia from that point, which is, the development of the eschaton. But at the same time, That's an eschatological coming that's focused there. And so the next thing he says in the text, for our purposes here, is death reigned from Adam to Moses. And demonstrating that death, the result of sin, etc., is reigning all the way from Adam to Moses. So when they get to the latter verses of chapter 5, he talks about the law entering that the offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace abounded much more. So that as sin reigned in death, so even so grace might reign through righteousness to eternal life through Jesus our Lord. Now that's the context that he's dealing with in Romans chapter 6. He hasn't changed the subject one bit, or one whit, as they say. In verse 1, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in the sin that the grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? So now he talks about how they die to sin. And what I find here is very interesting to me, because he says, or do you not know that as many of us as were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? How many of the Romans done had been baptized into the physical death of Jesus? I asked Howard Denham that question one time, and he liked to blow a gasket.
I can well imagine.
It was so funny.
And the power of that, William, is because you and I both know Howard Denham has quoted Romans chapter 6, 3 and following 5 gazillion times.
Yes.
And he didn't even understand what he was quoting.
Exactly. So this is also telling us the nature of the death that Christ died, because it says they were baptized not into their death, but into his death. Well, that can't be the physical body of Jesus rising and, dying and rising from the dead. That has to do with that eschatological death, that purpose for which he died, which was to put away sin. That's what they were baptized into. That's what the context is dealing with. It's dealing with they're not continuing in sin because, as the scripture says, they died to it. But it's a dying that's not yet completed. That's not yet consummated. But neither is the rising completed. And that's part of what Scott and many of them want to argue. They want to argue that this was a completed process. And this, by the way, gets back to the atonement as well. Right. Because the scripture says, therefore, we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father. Now watch this. Even so, we also should
subjunctive
walk in newness of life. The air is subjunctive, and that's indicating their participation. It's indicating it's already underway, but it's not yet completed. And A.T. Robertson, in his Greek grammar, he points out that the subjunctive demonstrates the probability of something occurring in the future. It's not that it has occurred. And he said that's why it's kind of laid right alongside the future. And that's what you have in the next verse. For if we have been united in the likeness of his death, certainly we also shall be in the likeness of his resurrection. Well, that's the future of that same rising that they had begun in their baptism. It was not a physical dying, nor was it a physical rising. Baptism was a medium through which they entered that process, and it was to be consummated at the parousia. And so hence you have a text that is, again, grossly misunderstood, because we like to individualize. And when I say we, I'm talking about people in general, not you and me and other preterists who understand this. But when he says, knowing this, that our old man, well, that's a collective, that's a corporate old man. Same one in Colossians 3, 9 and 10, and Ephesians 4, 22 through 24, and such passages. Knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, but watch, again, here comes the aorist subjunctive, that the body of sin might be done away. He didn't say it was done away, that it might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin. Let me read a couple more verses here. For he who has died has been freed from sin. Well, that sounds like it's all wrapped up. But notice, now if we died with Christ, and this is almost parallel to 2 Timothy 2:11.
Yes.
Now, if we died with Christ, we believe. What is belief? That's faith. We believe that we shall, future tense, also live with him. So that process was not a completed process. And then the next verse, it tells you what death Jesus died. Another point that Scott really didn't want to acknowledge because he kept trying to make it physical. But the text says Jesus died to sin.
And I want to go back there to a point that you read but did not develop. If we have been buried with him in the likeness of his death, well, pretty clearly those people hadn't been buried in the ground as a dead
Right.
corpse. We shall be also in the likeness of his resurrection. And he says, if we have been buried with him in the likeness of his death. Well, let me reemphasize that point. They had not died biologically. Who would argue such a thing? Just like you asked Howard Denham, baptized into Christ's death. Well, were they baptized into physical, biological death? No. And anyone thinking rationally and logically can see that. So the point I'm trying to emphasize here is what you sort of kind of developed was, if they were baptized into the death of Christ, but it wasn't biological death that they were baptized into, if they were buried with him in the likeness of his death, they had not been buried physically as dead individuals, and therefore the likeness of his resurrection. How do we shift from not physical death, not physical burial in the ground, to the raising of a biologically dead body out of the grave?
Yeah,
that's a change in hermeneutic in midstream.
Yeah, it's a total change. It's just totally different from what Paul is saying. Another important point here is that the word planted here is the word for sown.
Yes.
And the scripture says that you cannot, be raised unless you're sown. So how were they sown? Were they sown physically to rise in a different immortal body? I don't think anybody would claim that they were immortal from the perspective of their resurrection and baptism. That's not the same, but they did rise into a state of immortality, at least in its inaugural.
They were born again of incorruptible seed.
They were born again of incorruptible seed. And so here is the sowing. And I argue that this is the same sowing of 1 Corinthians 15. And it worked basically for them as well as for the dead ones in terms of what was actually taking place, because it was a sowing that will allow them to be dying to sin and rising to, as you say, righteousness and incorruption.
So to reemphasize the point, they were baptized into Christ's death. Now watch, the death that he died unto sin.
Correct.
He wasn't the death there is not, well, he died to the biological world. He did not die to the physical reality, the material reality in Paul's discourse. Now, when Jesus died biologically, sure, he died to the world. But that is absolutely not Paul's point. He died to sin. They died, or they were baptized into his death, which means they were baptized into a death to sin. So
well, that's also covenantal, is it not?
Oh, absolutely covenantal.
His dying, because he was born of a woman made under the law.
Yes.
So he came into that world, which you entered that world through natural birth, but natural birth under the law. And Paul points those two things out. Born of a woman, that's his natural birth. Born under the law, that's his covenantal entrance into, Israel's old covenant. Well, when he dies to the law, but he's raised still in the flesh in terms of biology, but not in the flesh in terms of his covenantal stance.
Exactly.
Just like Romans 1:3 says, he was born of the seed of David according to the flesh, but was declared to be the Son of God according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. That's why in Acts 13, you have the scripture that says, today you are my son, this day have I begotten you. He was the first begotten out of the dead ones. That's what made him the first fruit, because he's the first begotten, the first to enter into that new covenant realm, a totally different realm than what he was in. It's so beautiful that it's just shameful that people miss it and argue for these physical things. And again, we're not denying one iota the physical death, and resurrection of Jesus. They ate with him, they saw him, they touched him, etc., etc. Yes, they did. But that was not the ultimate meaning of his resurrection. He didn't die to raise physical bodies out of the ground.
On that point, William, just over the last 2 weeks, I was corresponding with one lady, wonderful lady, good student, and what have you. And she was having difficulty seeing why the physical is not the point. And I said, well, here's something to consider. And that is, nobody is depreciating or disparaging the significance of the physical death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. I certainly am not. I said, I don't know of any preterist that disparages or discounts the importance of those physical realities. But I said, what we have to do is to realize that the physical death, burial, and resurrection pointed to a greater spiritual reality. John, in the book of John, John recorded 7 miracles of Jesus, which are called signs. I don't know of anybody, William, maybe you do, I don't think you do, but I don't know of anybody that would say, well, Jesus turning water into wine proves that, well, one of these days we're going to have tons and tons more wine.
Oh, no. No. I made that point in my debate with Steve Wiggins, remember?
Yeah.
I made a list of those things that Jesus had done in pointing out that, when he said, I'm the bread of life, he wasn't teaching us how to have a restaurant. and he wasn't teaching us how to be a whales when he said he was the living water, etc. So, yeah, excellent points.
And then John closes out his gospel with the story of the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus. And he says, truly many other signs did Jesus perform, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe. So he is setting forth Jesus's physical death, burial, and resurrection, really and honestly, as the paramount sign of his entire gospel. Mm-hmm. Now, if not one of the other signs, okay, leading up to his own personal death, burial, and resurrection, if not one of those signs pointed to a similar greater physical reality, then how do we shift gears all of a sudden and say, oh, yeah, but now his physical resurrection points to our physical resurrection? It makes no sense, and it breaks the entire narrative of the sign nature of everything in the book of John. And we cannot forget John chapter 16, the Jews came to Jesus and said, what sign will you show us that we might believe? Well, he'd already been performing one sign after another. But nonetheless, Jesus said, well, no sign's going to be given except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights, even so shall the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. So what was Jesus saying? The sign that you ought to believe is my physical resurrection. That's the ultimate sign. But what did that point to? It points to exactly what John said in John chapter 20, 30, and 31. Here's the physical sign. What's it for? That you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that believing you might have life through his name. So the physical pointed to the spiritual. And yet people get completely hung up. Matter of fact, Jan and I were talking about this very reality this week. I was reading some comments by someone, I've forgotten now exactly who it was. It might have been on YouTube, Facebook, whatever. But their comments were, I don't know of a better way to say it, except their comments were just downright carnal. Mm-hmm. So materialistic, so focused on physical realities that they could not see what you were pointing out in Romans chapter 1. He was the seed of David according to the flesh. He was born of the seed of David according to the flesh, but he was declared to be the Son of God with power through the resurrection of the dead, out from among the dead, literally. And so here are the New Testament writers repeatedly pointing to, yeah, no doubt about it, physical realities of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. What did it point to, folks? Greater spiritual realities, never greater physical realities. Yet that's precisely what Clem was doing,
Yes.
pointing to greater physical realities. Oh, our physical realities. And again, to repeat the point that we've just made, that violates Romans chapter 6, that he just, nobody wants to deal with, because it is setting forth Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, which once again was physical. But now Paul is raising it to a higher level. They were not baptized into the physical death of Christ. They were baptized into the death to sin. They were raised to walk in newness of life, just like Christ died or was raised to die no more. Okay. Even so, likewise, you also consider yourselves dead to sin. So here's Christ, death, burial, resurrection, into a new realm of existence. Baptized into Christ, his death, raised to walk in newness of life, raised never to die again. Now, that raises another issue that was discussed in the debate, William, although not extensively. I was looking for it today in my notes. I thought I remembered that you raising the point, perhaps, and I've watched 4 or 5 debates lately. I've watched some debates between Chris Date and different individuals and what have you. So it's possible that I'm transposing something from one of those debates. But the point, I believe that you made the point, did you not, that we have eternal life, and that Jesus said, if a man keep my saying, he will never die. But if a man, John chapter 11, 25 and 26, if a man believe on me, though he dies, yet shall he live. And if a man keep my sayings, he shall never die. Well, Clem sees death as biological death. That doesn't work in John 8:51 or John 11, 25 and 26. How do you deal with that in relationship with Jesus' promise, he shall never die? And by the way, if you go to Bible Gateway and you look up John 8:51 and John 11, 25 and 26, you will find that in every single English translation, there is no variance. Shall never die. Now, was I imagining that? Did you bring that up in your debate?
I think I brought that text up because I spoke about Jesus being the resurrection.
Yeah.
From John 11. And I'm almost certain that I brought up John 8:51 as well as 25 and 26 of John 11 to demonstrate that, when I pointed out that, Christ is the resurrection, and the resurrection in him comes through faith and not through coming out of the ground. And I probably made some other points connected with it. But yes, I did use that text.
Okay. Then I had down, let me see here. I thought I marked this today. Oh yeah. This was, this was such a loaded question. Well, you brought up Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. Paul said, I am convinced that the one who's begun a good work in you will complete it at the day of the Lord. And so he responded by saying, are you telling us, or is God still not doing a good work today? William, is God still not working good stuff today?
Well, of course, God is still working providentially, but that working in that text had to do with the working out of the salvation that had begun in Christ. And that's what he says in that text. He will perform it until the day of Christ. And you also have Romans 13, 11 and 12, that basically says the same thing. Now is our salvation nearer than when we first believed. And so that's the salvation that was coming to its consummation. Again, that's Hebrews 9:28, and various other passages that mention salvation at the return of Christ. So, yes, that was being worked out from that point of view. God is not reworking it out. This is like I mentioned to him in the debate when I was pointing out the exile. You don't, after they get to the promised land, the first generation who made it into the promised land. And that was the fulfillment of the promise. Well, God didn't take every succeeding generation after that from a physical point of view and tell them, now you got to run your 40 years through the wilderness in order to come into the promised land. No, they were born into it because it was an existing hope already fulfilled, and they simply were born into it and received all the blessings of it as a result. And that's the same parallel with the kingdom of God. God did not have to go through the process of redoing the kingdom of God, sending them back through those eschatological sufferings. That's not to say that people don't suffer, but they are not the same eschatological sufferings that pertain to the last days, those birth pangs that were specific, happening in that present time, as Romans 8:18 says, that were necessary, as you pointed out in your work on Thessalonians, that this is tribulation they were then suffering, and God would bring retribution for that tribulation. Scott didn't look like he was suffering too much from tribulation. He might have been having some tribulation with some arguments.
I think he was in tribulation. I think he was in the great tribulation, personally.
From that perspective,
from that perspective, yes.
yes. But no, this when he said, it was necessary that they must enter the kingdom through much tribulation, and that this was the suffering for the kingdom of God, which was necessary. That's not the same, like John said in Revelation 1:9, I am John, your brother and companion in the tribulation and in the kingdom, from that perspective. So we just don't seem to have an appreciation for those events that were taking place in the first century. And yet, when you're not arguing with the full preterists, you'll watch them. They'll trip up and they'll say, yeah, that's first century stuff. A lot of times they do.
This, William, gets back to the significance of audience relevance, does it not? When we read the scriptures, wasn't it Gene Fadley who said time and again from the pulpit, we have to remember we're reading someone else's mail?
Correct.
And yet 9 out of 10 people today, when they read about these events, I think I pointed out last week that 2 weeks ago, a guy on my YouTube channel said the rapture will be next week.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I responded to him and I said, how much you want to bet on that? And he wrote back and he said, 50 cents. and I said, dude, you don't believe what you're teaching very much.
Exactly.
But they take statements that were made to living, breathing human beings living in a very real world of persecution, of ostracism, of shame. And don't get me started on the shame versus glory concept here, but they were living in that world. And we modern Bible readers transpose that. And when Paul says, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed in us. And I'll never forget, right here in Ardmore, Oklahoma, going through the controversy at the congregation that I was at, a very noted minister from the Church of Christ got a hold of gospel meeting at one of the other congregations in town. I attended. He was teaching a class that morning. And boy, he starts in Romans chapter 18, the sufferings of this present time. Well, his wife had contracted cancer. His son had been in a horrible accident. And he said, I know that many of you have experienced the same kind of horrific events. And he said, Paul understood that. But Paul said, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time. And so he goes on and on. So for him, the sufferings of this present time are teenage kids. It's financial distress, it's cancer, it's heart trouble, it's this, it's that, it's all the, may I use the terminology, it's all the natural part of the physical world in which we are living. Paul was talking about them, the Romans, experiencing what he calls in Romans 8:17. In so many translations, there's a subject division inserted between the verses, And Romans 8:18 and following is the redemption of creation. Well, the trouble of it is, verse 17 goes right along with it. where Paul says you need to rejoice that you're participating in the sufferings of Christ. And those sufferings of Christ are those eschatological sufferings that you were referring to there just a moment ago. That were being filled up in that first century generation, as Paul said in Colossians chapter 1:24. I now rejoice in my sufferings for you, and I fill up in my flesh that which is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for you, the body, which is the church, of which he has made me a minister according to the stewardship of the gospel. And he said, I've been given this stewardship to complete the mystery of God, or the word of God, which is the mystery. So Paul puts his sufferings in an eschatological context of filling up the measure of sin. And people just blithely read right over it, as if that's still being done today, as if Jesus never said that Israel was going to fill up the measure of her sin and that generation. Pardon me. Okay, I want to close out on this, William. I just about fell out of my chair when you brought this point up, when you emphasized that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 10 times, Paul uses either the present passive indicative or the present active indicative. And you asked Scott, how do you deal with this? And you brought up 1 Corinthians 15:26. If the dead are not being raised. And Scott just basically sat there for a moment. And then finally he said, well, you can't use just a few verses to prove anything. And like I said, I nearly fell out of my chair here in my office going, okay, so you've used just a couple of passages here and there to prove your entire point. But when William brings up the fact that you've got at least 10, maybe 11 by count, most of them are present passives. There's one present and active indicative. So when you bring these up, even though it's not just one verse, it's 10 or 11. Well, William, you just can't do that.
Yeah. You know, and one of the things that I did also in relation to that was pointed out from 2 Timothy 1:10, using his same logic that Paul said death had been abolished. Same word, cardigeo,
Yes.
that's used in 1 Corinthians 15:26. And if that's the case, then how is he going to interpret the text there in contrast to 1 Corinthians 15:26? And then pointing out, as you say, that the text says the last enemy that is being destroyed is death. But I think those time statements in 1 Corinthians 15 were really giving him fits.
Oh yeah.
He tried to, acknowledge that he agreed with them, and it would even say, well, yeah, this happened, but we're going to get the rest of it later. And what I thought was really funny was his going to First Thessalonians 4, and trying to make the case there, and wouldn't touch the statements, we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord. So he just totally ignored that. But yeah, that was it. And by the way, let me make this correction before we close this out. I searched for that, and maybe I had something else in mind, but I didn't find the aorist subjunctive. I'm not going to stop looking because I think I found something on that, but I could be thinking of another word. So I don't want to leave the presentation and leave that out there, and it turns out not to be the case. So
okay,
I'll go back and check, but just wanted to
yeah, and I want to see those when you have them. They may come in handy on my debate with Chris Date.
Yeah.
As we close, William, just a very, very, very quick comment. How do you respond to those who say, we have been made free from death through the body of Christ? And what that means is we will die, but we will then be resurrected and never die then.
All right. We have been made free from death through the body of Christ, and then we will
die.
Be resurrected. Yeah, we're going to die and then never die again. Well, first of all, I mean, just real quick, that contradicts what we just talked about in John 8:51 and John 11 that says we shall never see death. physical death was never a part of it. I'm just, trying to think quickly to give a response, but that's just not what the scripture is teaching us. If we never see death, and that's physical death, then it means that Jesus' death, number one, has done nothing other than what they had under the old covenant.
Exactly.
They had physical death there. They got physical death now. He's died, and yet he can't remove the death that they claim is the death of Adam. And interestingly, if I'm not mistaken, Scott will argue that the death of Adam was separation from God.
Yes.
And yet he comes later and wants to make that physical death.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate it so very much. I think that will wrap up the review of your debate with Scott Clem. And let's see. Oh, I would just very quickly point this out. I had a super, super good interview with a young man named Tommy McMurtry on his blog last night. That will be aired in a couple of weeks, and he'll send me a link to that, I'm sure. He is he's not a dispensationalist. He is a post-trib premillennialist. There are three different classes of postmillennial or premillennialist, excuse me. And yet he has the courage to say, and he said it on air, that he thinks that there are several arguments in that paradigm that are very, very weak. And he even said, and I'm not trying to ascribe anything to him beyond what he said, okay? I'm not trying to give any false impression, but he actually said a couple of different times during the program that the comments that I was making actually made a lot of sense. So I enjoyed it a great deal. I was uncertain how the program would go, knowing that he was a futurist and knowing that he has some associations with some people that can be pretty caustic, to be honest about it. So I told Jan, I said, I don't know if this is a setup. I really don't know if I'm walking into the lion's den, but I told her, I said, I've been in the lion's den several times, so I'm not too concerned about it.
Yeah.
But it went great. So I'll announce that as soon as I have a link from Tommy. In the meantime, folks, thanks for joining us here on Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. And with that, I'll say good night. God bless.
Right.
All right, William, I'm going to go eat.
Okay, real quick, one question. Anthony Aquino, and I wonder if that's the next person they want to engage in a resurrection debate. But he keeps asking this question. I know, well, he asked it during the debate. He asked about Jesus dying. How many times did he die,
yes,
et cetera?
Yeah.
What's your quick response to that?
I don't know that I've got the greatest response except to say this. And I've brought this up in private correspondence with Anthony. When Jesus put off the form of God, did God die? If he didn't, then Jesus putting off the form of man to re-enter heaven and the glory that he had with the Father before the foundation of the world, that doesn't necessarily demand that he die. As you wrote in a little piece you sent me years ago on the same Jesus, in which you pointed out, Acts 1:11, a change in Jesus's form did not mean that it was not the same Jesus.
Exactly.
And so to me, that's the best explanation that I know of. So what's yours?
Well, I've just been trying to think of some things, those points, particularly, but even, arguing about dying twice. Several people in the Bible died twice, faithful men. Would that keep them from their inheritance? No. So dying twice is not really an issue. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the view that I hold.
Right.
I don't believe Jesus entered heaven with his physical body.
Correct.
But even, trying to look at it from their perspective, if you say, well, you got Jesus dying twice. Well, he only died once for sin. That's the main point.
That's the main point.
And that's the point that I made when they brought it up in the debate, that he only died once for sin. So if he dies again, that doesn't make him die for sin, and therefore it would have no bearing on the one death for sin, because that's the one that was for the atonement.
Yeah, and
anyway,
I think that's an excellent point. And by the way, this Chris Date guy, I'm sure that he's going to ask that question: did Jesus die twice? But Chris Date loves to appeal to Enoch. He loves to appeal to, quote, Jewish belief. He loves to appeal to the patristics. Well, in some of the intertestamental writings, to whom he appeals for a belief in physical resurrection for a belief in something other than eternal conscious torment. Those same identical sources believed in the immortality of the soul, which Chris Date rejects. But get this, in one of the books called The Ascension of Isaiah, there was he had a vision. This is supposedly Isaiah, but he had a vision and he saw Enoch standing in the heavenly court, and they took from him his fleshly garments and gave him a garment of glory.
Yeah, I've read that.
Yeah. And we have similar statements like that in some of the other intertestamental books, that in order to enter heaven, they had to put off the body of flesh. They had to put off the body of flesh. And so that, you got these passages. And again, these are books that Chris Date likes to appeal to.
Yeah.
And yet,
well, I think they're great arguments. I think it's a great argument, because you even have glimpses of that in the New Testament. In terms of this change of garments of glory. And,
Margaret Barker's comments on that, the garments of glory, is just great. Absolutely great. So, the high priest could not enter into the most holy place wearing his garments of earth. Couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. All right, man.
All right. I sent your check out today, so thanks. I got my books right here.
Okay. Thank you. I was going to ask you if you got them. All right, man.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. You're welcome. Bye.